Welcome to CWJah Talk number 37. The appointed times of the nations according to Luke 21:24 and the 7 times of Daniel mentioned in Daniel chapter 4 verse 32. Are these referring to the same thing? What are they referring to? In a video I did recently about why I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses who doesn't support the Watchtower, I mentioned a couple of things that happened around 2003 involving a book that I wrote, 3 dissertations, and a well-known former member of the Watchtower Society, Rolf Ferrulli. And I talked about how back when I wrote 3 dissertations, this book right here, which isn't online right now unless someone's selling it, but my Elihu Books site, elihubooks.com, will be fully online, or at least online enough to where you can get that book again within about a week. When I wrote this book back in 2003, like I talked about in that other video I mentioned, I had a falling out with the Watchtower apologist community, and in particular Rolf Ferrulli, and I stopped associating with Jehovah's Witnesses for several years until I went through a period of personal growth and then started again doing biblical studies and ultimately formed the Christian Witnesses of Jah. I talked about how after I started doing Bible studies again, believing in God, living as a Christian, forming the Christian Witnesses of Jah, and then ultimately getting to a point where I created this YouTube channel. I talked about how I became aware that Rolf had been disfellowshipped from the Watchtower Society, and how that was very surprising to me because Rolf has been a member, or had been, for a lot longer than I had. And he had been in positions far beyond what I had reached in my time as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in the Watchtower Society. And I pointed out how, I was considering going back and helping to try and bring about positive changes within the organization because people were bringing to my attention different growing problems and difficulties, even more so than I had experienced. And then when I found out about Rolf's disfellowshipping, I realized there was more going on. There was seemingly a bigger problem or issue, because if someone like Rolf was being disfellowshipped, then I knew that the people running the Watchtower had some issues, either with him or just with the beliefs that Rolf was promoting so strongly. And one of those beliefs that Rolf was and may still be behind. I haven't spoken with Rolf in a long time. I just know him from before, and I found out about what happened to him recently. And so, whether or not Rolf and I agree on things like chronology, 1914, the subject of today, the appointed times of the nations, the 7 times of Daniel, wasn't what I was really getting at in that why I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses who doesn't support the Watchtower video. I was pointing out simply that Rolf had begun standing up to things he saw that were not correct in his view, like I had done with my 3 dissertations book in 2003. And so I could see where I would be able to work with people like Rolf, who are very influential and have a long history with the society, and who I worked with before, if I were going to try and bring about some kind of positive change within the organization. I'm always willing to help people and help any organization. I just don't believe I can effectively do that kind of thing within the organization. I don't even think the organization believes that's what you should do if you're a real Christian, like I talked about in my Watchtower Apologist Collapse Part 1 video, the 1970 Watchtower, where it makes very plain that you're not, that if you really believe something is not right, you should separate yourself from it. That you should follow the example of Paul. something a lot of Watchtower apologists today don't do at all. But nevertheless, now that I know Rolf is willing to stand up to things he doesn't believe are correct, then of course I would be open to working with him to help anybody. And in particular, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses involved with the Watchtower Society. That does not mean that I agree with Rolf on everything or that he agrees with me. And one of those things that I think Rolf at least has a lot more strong views than I do and a lot more background and involvement with is this chronology involving the Gentile times or the appointed times of the nations, like the New World Translation renders Luke 21:24. So just because I can support Rolf in his stand against some of the things in the Watchtower Society, that doesn't mean I agree or would agree with his position on chronology. I haven't talked to him, as I said recently, so I really don't know where he stands right now. But I do know that Rolf had a lot of involvement with Carl Olof Johnson, the author of The Gentile Times Reconsidered. And, they are two individuals who really took this subject to probably the furthest extent in relation to the Watchtower Society's view. And when I wrote this book back in 2003, I corresponded with Carl Olof Johnson, and I referred to that correspondence frequently in the section dealing with the Gentile times. It's an appendix that I added to the 3 dissertations in that book. And I don't, it's not that I was agreeing with Carl Olof Johnson and everything, but we had a good discussion, a good email correspondence, and I was able to utilize it in ways. I shared with him material that I was preparing because I wanted his perspective. I wanted to know where I might be wrong or where I needed to address issues further, because he and Rolf had gone further than I had. In particular, where it involves, things like Ptolemy's canon, King's List, different eclipses, things that I don't have the background with and just didn't have the time to get into as much as they did. My main interest is in the Bible, and while that does go outside of the Bible, that doesn't mean I can become an expert on everything. But what I could do when I was writing this book and wanted to give my view on the Gentile times was take a look at what the Bible had to say when it came to the texts that the Society was citing and cites today to support its view. And that's what I did. So let me just bring up for you the contents of 3 dissertations so you understand, once it's online again, what it contains. This book here doesn't get as much attention as my Jehovah's Witnesses Defended books because, well, in that book, I talk about the positives and the negatives of things involved with the Watchtower Society, kind of like I do today. And so people who are 100% behind the Watchtower Society, when they see the negative things, they don't like the book. People who hate all things Watchtower, when they see me pointing out things that are good in my view about the Society's teachings, they don't like the book. So it just doesn't get a lot of play. It just doesn't get referred to by either side because I don't think they like one part or the other enough to reference it. Whatever the case, you'll be able to get that book again online if you want to within about a week. So what does it contain? Well, let me bring up the contents so you can see. Right? So in this publication that I'm going to be reviewing in part today, at least the appendix involving the Gentile times, the first dissertation talks about the authority of the great crowd and the authority of the faithful slave. And then I have an excursus on C.T. Russell and whether he was the faithful slave. Right? So again, I give a balanced presentation, at least in my view, of these issues. And I point out the difference in authority between these two groups, one of which, of course, couldn't possibly even be here yet because the great crowd doesn't come until after the tribulation. But nevertheless, Watchtower Society does identify the great crowd as here today, and so discussing it in relation to the faithful slave made sense. Now, in my defended editions, and in particular my second edition, the darker cover, I have a whole section on the Watchtower and false prophecy where I go into detail about things that have been said and allegations that have been made as to whether or not they're a false prophet. But I don't go into every single date that the Watchtower Society has given significance to. In the second dissertation of this book, I do. Pretty much every date that I could find that the Watchtower at one point attached prophetic or biblical significance to, right? All the way from 1798, a lot of dates a lot of you probably haven't heard about in relation to the Society. I read through all of the reprints of the Watchtower and many of the originals, and I came up with everything I could. And I provided notes, citing every text that I could find where these dates were brought up, all the way through 1975. And I've talked about this generation in other writings. And I talk about a little bit in here as well. And then in the third dissertation, this is where I really give the most balanced presentation in terms of the pros and cons, right? I give the Society credit for properly identifying the one God as the Father, 1 Corinthians 8:6, and his Son, not as a second person of a Trinity, but as his firstborn one, and the name of God. And in this section, I respond to Ray Franz and his writings involving that name of God, in particular In Search of Christian Freedom, where I believe Ray Franz did a huge disservice to everybody. I realize he went through something that's important for us to know in ways that he talked about in his Crisis of Conscience. But then he went further and talked about things he clearly does not understand. And he repeats a lot of the mistakes that those who look to Ray Franz as this, guiding light to get out of the Watchtower followed him in believing, which is why among so many former witnesses today, I believe, we have such a problem with the name of God. They keep calling him Yahweh, which is not true. It contradicts a massive amount of phonetic evidence that shows that's not true. And I've talked about this in several other videos involving the divine name, as well as in my writings on the divine name, and I'm going to do so again soon. So I address Ray Franz, and I point out the mistakes he made, which is why, again, I don't think a lot of former witnesses like this book very much. They like the negative things I say. They don't like it when they find out that things they followed Ray Franz in believing are also a mistake in some significant ways. Whatever the case, I then point out problems I believe exist with the Watchtower's view and teaching on blood transfusions and legalism, right? Their requirements for hours and going out in service and numbers of meetings and things like this. Then, after the third dissertation, I have this appendix. Have the Gentile times ended? And I don't, again, think a lot of people realize this is there. And the detail in which I went to discuss the issues involving the Bible and my correspondence with people like Carl Olof Johnson, which also then involved correspondence with other people, as you'll see. So let's get to that appendix. And we're going to read parts of it, and we're going to read the Bible. Okay? Those are the notes, and this is the appendix. Have the Gentile times ended? So, and then this is where the notes start on page 254. And we're going to read a quote to set the table first about the Watchtower Society's view of the appointed times of the nations in Luke 21 and the 7 times of Daniel 4. We're going to read a quote from this book, Let Your Kingdom Come, page 189, published in 1981. This is the Society's view, more or less. There may be some changes at this point, but pretty much I think this is still consistent with how they see the appointed times of the nations or the Gentile times, and 1914. The inspired Bible writer Ezra reported that the 70 years until the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, who issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, that these 70 years that are referred to would run until this decree of Cyrus, which the society views as a what they call a pivotal date, 537, even though there's a couple years of variance that could be involved there. They refer to that frequently, those of you in the Watchtower Society know, as a pivotal date, like it's like no one contests it. And again, it is contested to some extent, but depending on how you apply the 70 years, and there could be a variation of a couple of years between 537 and 539, basically. So, and as the book goes on, the historians accept that Cyrus conquered Babylon in October 539 BCE, and that Cyrus's first regnal year began in the spring of 538. This is the society's position on this. If Cyrus's decree came late in the first regnal year, the Jews could easily be back in their homeland by the 7th month, Tishri, as Ezra 3:1 says. This would be October 537 BCE. What the Watchtower Society and its supporters will refer to again as a pivotal date. You'll see why in a second. It seems evident that the easiest and most direct understanding of the various biblical statements, we're going to get to them, is that the 70 years began with the complete desolation of Judah after Jerusalem was destroyed. And these are the texts we're going to get to in just a moment. Now, those are 3 of them anyway. Hence, this is the society's argument, how they understand it, counting back 70 years from when the Jews returned to their homeland in 537 BCE, we arrive at 607 BCE. So you see how the society connects this 70 years that we're going to talk about more in a moment with that pivotal date, and then counts backwards from 537, which is why they don't adopt the traditional view of the destruction of Jerusalem in 587. 587, 586, depending on how you see it. We arrive at 607 BCE for the date when Nebuchadnezzar, in his 18th regnal year, destroyed Jerusalem, removed Zedekiah from the throne, and brought to an end the Judean line of kings on a throne in earthly Jerusalem. So they attach this 70 years to the time when, from or backwards from the pivotal date of Cyrus's decree, and they identify it as the time when Zedekiah, who was a vassal king, right? He was a king appointed as a vassal or representative for Babylon, but was ultimately removed when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of some of the points that go into the society's understanding of 607 BCE, how they get to 607 BCE from 537, and then from 607 they count forward to 1914. We didn't get specific on where they get to 1914 from 607, but I wanted to cover this so that you understand at first why they use 607. They count backwards from 537, the year of Cyrus's decree that they recognize according to their view of the time when Cyrus conquered Babylon, and then Cyrus's, first regnal year, and then the decree. So, have a couple years there where events are happening, but they basically identify 537 as the point back from which they count 70 years, and then they get to 607. Okay, so what are these 70 years? Why are we using 70 years counting backwards from 537 to get to 607? Well, there's 4 key texts that the society uses to go backwards from 537 to 607, and then count forward to 1914. Let's go ahead and take a look at those 4 texts. All right. First, what we'll do is take a look at the text as I have presented them here, and the issues that are involved, my correspondence with Carl Olof Johnson, and so you understand, hopefully, the technical side of where this goes, or where it should go, or where it could go. Then we're going to go right to the main texts in Daniel and in Luke, and we're going to identify what they're talking about. Okay, I think it's really clear, actually. But we need to cover this stuff first, so you understand, because the society really is the one making and has made the biggest issue out of this appointed times of the nations in Luke 21 and the 7 times of Daniel. All right, so I just covered from their publication how they understand from 537, the decree of Cyrus, they go back 70 years to get to 607. Okay, this is why you have this conflict between historians and the society involving 587 and 607. So let's take a look at the first text, Jeremiah 25. See if I can make that a little bit more readable. There we go. There we go. Excuse me. Better take a drink. Start talking a lot, you know. Jeremiah 25, 10 through 12. I've highlighted this part because I'm going to read it to you from my appendix, Have the Gentile Times Ended? I'm not going to read all of it, but I think it's better if we just read parts of it together, because it'll be a lot easier for me than summarizing some of these points in my correspondence with Carl Olof Johnson. Regarding the use of Jeremiah 25, 10 through 12, Johnson, and by that I mean Carl Olof Johnson, Gentile Times Reconsidered, argues that rather than meaning 70 years of complete desolation for Jerusalem, Jeremiah's prophecy actually refers to a period of servitude. The prophecy states, "And all this land must become a devastated place, an object of astonishment, and these nations will have to serve the king of Babylon 70 years." This text and the surrounding context clearly refer to the devastation of this land, Judah. But there is no explicit link between the devastation and the 70-year period mentioned. In other words, the text does not say this land will be devastated for 70 years, like the society interprets it. Johnson is correct when he argues that the 70 years of Jeremiah 25, 11 through 12, explicitly, meaning that's what the text actually says, like right up here, serve the king of Babylon 70 years. That's what it says. He's correct when he says, Johnson, that is, the 7 years of Jeremiah 25, 11 through 12 explicitly refers to a period of servitude to Babylon by these nations, namely the nations surrounding Judah, including all the nations and peoples mentioned in Jeremiah 25, 15 through 29. This is clear from what is said in Jeremiah 25, 9, where reference is made to both this land, Judah, and its inhabitants, and against all these nations round about. Therefore, this text does not offer any indisputable support to the Watchtower's interpretation of 70 years of desolation for the land of Judah, though it is still possible to link the two clauses to the time period of 70 years. Because, again, in the context, specifically Jeremiah 25:9, it talks about this land and its inhabitants and against all these nations round about. So the land is connected with the inhabitants, whom the text referencing 70 years explicitly identify as serving the king. Okay? So it's possible that the Watchtower's view of this text involving 7 years of desolation for the land is true, but it's more likely, based on the explicit reading of Jeremiah 25:11, that it's referring to servitude, as Johnson and I believe. All right, now, again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's a lot more here. I encourage you, if you're interested, to get this book, read the whole appendix, the other information that I provide in the second dissertation on all the dates that relate to this same issue, and then you can read it for yourself. So I'm just going to deal with the specific texts. We'll read a little more on some of the others, but in terms of Jeremiah 25:10 through 12, it is less likely that the society's view that the land would be desolate for 70 years is true. It is more likely, and in fact explicitly stated in Jeremiah 25:11, that the 70 years refers to a period of servitude. Let's go to our next text. Again, there's a lot more I talk about my correspondence with Johnson on this issue, many different things, but we're going to move to Jeremiah 29:10 now. And here we're going to read basically the whole section. Okay, it's not that long, but this is important that we get the full understanding, because there's a little more involved here. The next text that mentions 70 years is Jeremiah 29:10. And remember, the 70 years is important because the society counts backwards from 537, the decree of Cyrus, regarding the Jews returning and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And rebuilding, the Jews returning home, basically. The society links 537 with this 70-year period and counts back to 607, from which they then count forward to 1914 using the 7 times of Daniel that we'll talk about further in a moment. All right, but we need to understand whether or not this 70 years has credibility or not. Okay, so far, Jeremiah 25:10 through 12, it's possible that involves a 70-year period of desolation for the land, but it's not explicit. It's a contextual interpretation. What is explicit is the servitude, 70 years. As previously noted, the Watchtower Society applies this 70 years to the period from 607 to 537 BCE. According to NWT, this text, Jeremiah 29:10, reads, in part, "For this is what Jehovah has said, in accord with the fulfilling of 70 years at Babylon, I shall turn my attention to you people, and I will establish toward you my good word in bringing you back to this place." Johnson, Carl F. Johnson, Gentile Times Reconsidered, believes that the context of this prophecy proves that the period of 70 years was already in progress, which would place the start of these 70 years prior to Jerusalem's destruction, since Jeremiah recorded his prophecy 18 years prior to that event. I do not see why it is necessary to conclude that the context of Jeremiah's prophecy proves the 70 years were already in progress. It is highly likely that the 70 years are also the period of servitude mentioned in Jeremiah 25:10 through 12 that we read just a moment ago, which would certainly offer support to Johnson's conclusion. Nevertheless, Jeremiah could be referring to a forthcoming period of desolation and or servitude different from the period of servitude already in progress. I find support for this view in the context of Jeremiah 28, which seems to suggest that a different yoke of servitude was forthcoming, namely a yoke of iron as opposed to a yoke of wood. In Jeremiah 28:14, Jehovah says, "A yoke of iron I will put upon the neck of all these nations to serve Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon." So there could have been either a forthcoming period of desolation or servitude or both. You with me? It's a little, I know. So I'm reading this through and I want to take our time, and you don't have to remember everything. But if you want to understand what's happening and the issues going on and involved with this whole 607 versus 587 down to 1914, there's a lot involved. But I'm going to try to break it down for you so you understand essentially whether or not the evidence falls on the side of the society or people like Carl Olof Johnson. The forthcoming yoke of servitude would be different from the one, this is according to how I viewed it in relation to my reading as I was writing this appendix, from the one they were presently under. This second period of servitude could involve 70 years as a round number, with only some nations experiencing exactly 70 years of servitude. Additionally, for those nations that had already experienced the severest punishments at the hands of Babylon, namely the kings in the Hattu area and the land of the Philistines, the forthcoming yoke of iron would not need to include them further. All these nations could be explained as an expression inclusive of those nations still in a state where they could have the yoke of iron placed upon them. All right, now we're going to get to the translation issue of this text that I think is significant for you to understand. Modern translations differ in how they translate Jeremiah 28:14. The NWT and the NIV use the future, "I will put," as does the Good News, the CEV for our Fenton, and I list several other translations. Many other translations use the English perfect, "I have put." And at least one translation uses a present, "I now lay," the New Jerusalem Bible. Translations which use an English future may be doing so because of the relationship between Natan, put, and the verb avad, which is translated with an English future in nearly all modern Bibles, "they will serve." The Hebrew perfect is timeless but gets time from the context. When viewed in relation to avad, I think a future translation is appropriate because it shows the results of the yoke of iron are yet future. Further, in light of the Hebrew preposition tachat, Jeremiah 28:13 involves the idea of an exchange. As for the false prophecy of Hananiah, his false report was in reference to his claim that within 2 full years the yoke of wood would be removed, which implied that no yoke at all would remain. Instead, the word of Jehovah occurred to Jeremiah in 28:13 and revealed that a yoke of iron would replace the yoke of wood, like I was talking about a moment ago, indicating a more severe punishment. All right, now focus on this part in particular. Johnson further argues that Jeremiah 29:10 does not refer to 70 years of desolation for the land of Judah and Jerusalem. Rather, he believes it refers to Babylon's supremacy, which places the other nations in servitude. Hence, the text so interpreted is in harmony with what Jeremiah 25:10 through 12, we read a moment ago, says about the servitude, right? That was explicit in verse 11, of the nations surrounding Judah. Johnson argues that the NWT's translation "at Babylon" in 29:10 is not the most likely meaning of the Hebrew expression "le Babal," which is the Hebrew preposition "le" prefixed to the Hebrew word for Babylon. Johnson cites various translations, Hebrew works, and scholars who argue against the locative, meaning having to do with location, meaning "at," and who favor the sense "for Babylon." The prepositions "le" and "be" have some semantic overlap relating to the basic sense of most Hebrew prepositions, which is spatial or locative according to Waltke and O'Connor's Hebrew grammar, which is quoted with approval by Johnson on this very point. Indeed, Waltke and O'Connor also state that "le" may mark location in or at a point. And they illustrate this sense with two examples. So it's hard to understand just what Dr. Tor Magnus Amble of the University of Oslo, Norway, meant when he wrote to Carl Olof Johnson and claimed that lay hardly has a locative sense and in any case not here in Jeremiah 29:10. Johnson cites Dr. Tor Magnus Amble on this point. But it doesn't. What he's saying does not make sense to me. It's does not. I don't believe his assessment is correct. His view of Jeremiah 29:10 is possible, but he does not offer sufficient support for his exclusive claims. Although Johnson himself accepts the possibility that lay can mean at, one of the scholars he quotes, Dr. Seth Erlandson, claims that the locative sense is impossible at Jeremiah 29:10. Erlandson's comment is an unfortunate overstatement of the point. It's things like that that have created a lot of division between former Watchtower people and those who support their view, right? The society can still be wrong, but we don't have to say things that are incorrect to show that's true. And so when Johnson or others cite people like Erlandson who say that certain things are impossible at a certain text when they're actually quite possible, it makes it more difficult. It makes our job as people who just want to understand what's true to the best of our ability more difficult. It makes communication between the different sides a lot more difficult. So I tried to bring some balance here, right? By looking at everything and saying, well, wait a minute. Okay, I don't fully agree with the society, but what you're saying is not true either. The preposition lay not only can carry a locative sense, having to do with location, at Babylon, in Jeremiah 29:10, but it also fits well in other contexts, including 1 Chronicles 9:1, which speaks of Judah's exile in or at or to Babylon, Hebrew la Babel. Compare the same expression and meaning in Ezra 2:1 and 5:12. In Jeremiah 24 and 41, we find be instead of lay, which also has a locative or directional locative sense, in or to. Because both prepositions can convey a directional locative sense that is to or into, we find be, not lay, in Jeremiah 27:20 and 29:1. So there is no need to place unnecessary restrictions on what an ancient Hebrew writer should or might have used to convey a given semantic. You see, this is why when I wrote my second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defend It, and I got into a lot of these, prophecy issues, it's statements like this that go overboard, like Erlandson's comment, that it's impossible in this text. It's very similar when it comes to a lot of allegations against society being false prophets and stuff. Even if that's correct, you don't have to go overboard and lie or misrepresent to people things to show that that may be correct. It just makes it more difficult for everybody. Either preposition can convey the sense of to or into, which can, with verbs of deportation and exile, include both the sense of direction in which one is carried away and the resulting location of the exile. It seems so obvious to me. When I read Erlandson's comment, it was just like, he didn't seem to be really seriously taking this matter in the way he needed to in order to make that comment. Or again, sometimes people are just so against the society, they overstate a negative position. I shared this with Carl Olof Johnson. I didn't just write this and not share it. After sharing a draft of this appendix with Carl Olof Johnson, Gentile Times Reconsidered, he inquired of Dr. Erlandson for comment on my statements concerning the meaning of le and be in several texts. Right? So this is what I was talking about when I said I had this correspondence with Johnson and others that he was using or in touch with and citing. And so Johnson shared what I was just reading to you, or part of it, to Dr. Erlandson, who then wrote back and stated, in part, with verbs of direction, le always means to, with verbs like deport, carry away into captivity, as is the case in point here, le may also mean into. And I underline this point for emphasis. And moreover, the result of this, i.e. that one comes to a country and remains there. Though he, Erlandson, initially gives deport, carry away into captivity as the sense of verbs like gala, the remainder of Dr. Erlandson's comments to Johnson show a preference for simply carried away. Even after he's reading what I just read to you in my position on this issue, when addressing texts involving le plus gala. However, the Hebrew Aramaic use of gala, 1 Chronicles 9:1, Ezra 2:1, 5:12, Jeremiah 24, 27:20, 29:1, or galut, Jeremiah 41, in these texts does not simply involve the act of carrying something or someone away. Rather, it has to do with the act of taking someone into exile. I believe Erlandson and Johnson did not properly state this matter either in Johnson's writing or in the correspondence he had with Erlandson after sharing with him part of my draft of this appendix. He still couldn't quite state it correctly, even though it seems so obvious. It has to deal with being not just carried away, but carried away into exile. If Dr. Erlandson is restricting the sense of gala to the action of being carried away, apart from the idea of exile, then naturally he would say, as he does in his comments to Johnson, a rendering in at Babylon is impossible. He says this with respect to 1 Chronicles 9:1, even as he had remarked similarly about the meaning of the text we're talking about right now, Jeremiah 29:10. But of course it would be impossible in such text to suggest that a person or group of persons is being carried away in at Babylon if the persons in question are being carried around the city itself. But that is not what is in view here. We're talking about the act of exile, or of being carried into exile, taken into exile. Once we properly define the semantics of galah, galut in relation to le or be plus Babylon, then the directional locative sense is easy to accept. Even Erlandson, as quoted above, recognizes that le may also mean into, and moreover, the result of this, i.e., that one comes into a country and remains there. That's his words after reading a draft of this appendix that Johnson shared with him. This is particularly clear in Jeremiah 21:9, where the idea is a transfer from one location, Jerusalem, to another location, Babylon. Such a sense conveying both the direction and resulting location of the exile can be communicated in English by using either to or into, both recognized and accepted meanings for le and be. So one could translate Jeremiah 29:10 as, when 70 years to Babylon have been fulfilled. It's not impossible. Erlandson is incorrect. No matter how smart he may be, he still couldn't quite come to grips with reality on this text, which is capable of conveying the idea of an exile to and resulting location in Babylon, depending on how one views the events of that time in relation to what is said in Jeremiah 29:10. And yet this is the book that really put me out of good standing with the society and the apologetic community. And yet here I am in correspondence with Johnson and Erlandson, his correspondence back and forth between us, defending the New World Translation, right? Finding out what's going on here. Carl Olaf Johnson and Dr. Erlandson, why are you saying this is impossible? It's not impossible. The NWT it could be correct. It's certainly not impossible. Johnson also referred me to French scholar Emile Nicol's response to a question about NWT's translation of at Babylon. To or at Babylon, right? Locational is what we're talking about. In Jeremiah 29:10. The Dictionary of Classical Hebrew is one of the works to which Nicol refers in his response. And it states that among other meanings, lay can convey the sense of direction. Number 2, to or towards. And place. Number 4, at. By, on, along, or over. This Hebrew dictionary, to which Johnson's other scholar, Emile Nicol's, referred, gives direct support for NWT's translation of lay as at. So again, I don't understand why Johnson had to take such a negative view, and in particular Erlandson or Nicol, of NWT's translation of Jeremiah 29:10. Was not necessary. But again, it just seems at times that people, and I respect Carl Olof Johnson and Rolf Feruli, and I think they both contributed a great deal to this discussion. I don't think any of it was really necessary, as you're going to see a little bit later when we get to some of the biblical texts. But some of the position and posturing and comments that have been made have misled a lot of people. And I tried to bring some balance to this discussion in my 3 dissertations appendix and in 3 dissertations as a whole. I just didn't attack the New World Church. I never do that, right? I'm about what is correct. Am I always correct? No, I don't claim to always be correct. I believe in 3 things that I believe you need to be correct on. But I try to be correct on everything else too, if I can. I don't just take a completely negative view when someone I disagree with has a certain position or translation of a text. It's not necessary. We don't need to overdo it and claim something's impossible when it's quite possible. Nicol refers to several of the examples given by this work to illustrate the meaning of at for lay. He first refers to Genesis 49:26 and Genesis 32:2, but neither of those texts are meant to illustrate the sense of at but on. Nicol refers to the dual use of lay in 2 Kings 11:11, where it is said that the runners kept standing by the altar and by the house. This clearly involves location, right? At, by, on location. Yet Nicol's only remark here is that lay is related to al, another Hebrew preposition which can convey the idea of proximity. He concludes his analysis of the examples presented in this dictionary, that is Nicol, with the following. The only example quoted where there is neither movement nor proximity is the first mention, Numbers 20:24. You were rebellious at the waters of Meribah. But it is also possible to understand the preposition lay, as does the French translation by Robnot Francas, and I apologize if I state that incorrectly, I don't speak French, respecting the waters of Meribah. I agree that lay in Numbers 20:24 can mean either at or respecting, but the point is not that either meaning is possible. Also, there is no reason for Nicol to remove from the pool of examples supporting the NWT rendering of Jeremiah 29:10 those instances where lay has a locative sense, simply because it can also be said to involve some idea of proximity. And then I give the text. All of these examples do support the locative sense of at in NWT, and that location is near or at the object or place mentioned, Babylon. Furthermore, Nicol is in error when he claims that the only example in the dictionary where lay involves neither movement nor proximity is Numbers 20:24. Isaiah 10:28 is also listed at Michmash. He deposits his articles. The idea here is hardly that the articles are stored near Michmash, but in Michmash. Nevertheless, in view of the uncertainty associated with the meaning of lay in Jeremiah 29:10, one cannot say for sure if it means to, into, for, or at. In terms of Hebrew semantics, the 70 years of Jeremiah may refer to a period of exile or to a period of Babylonian supremacy, which is Johnson's view, since neither the verbal idea of exile nor servitude to Babylon is specifically linked with lay in this text, Jeremiah 29:10. It seems that the best position is one that accepts both as possibilities, semantically speaking. So, again, just like with Jeremiah 25, it's not clear which is correct here, the idea of servitude or Babylonian supremacy. But the presentation by Johnson in relation to Erlandson and Nicole is incorrect. It is not balanced sufficiently to credit NWT the way it should be. And that's what I tried to do and did do here. Let's go to our third text involving the 70 years. Daniel chapter 9. We're just going to read this highlighted section. Daniel 9, 1 through 2. Here's what it says, according to the NWT. In the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus, the seed of the Medes, who had been made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reigning, I myself, Daniel, discerned by the books the number of years concerning which the word of Jehovah had occurred to Jeremiah, whom we've just been reading from Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29, the prophet. So now Daniel is discerning through the books, specifically Jeremiah, the fulfilling of the devastations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Unlike Jeremiah 25, 10 through 12 and Jeremiah 29, 10, this text seems to explicitly link 70 years with the devastations of Jerusalem. While there is no explicit reference to servitude or to Babylon's period of supremacy, Johnson connects Daniel's words to the prophecies in Jeremiah and thereby connects the 70 years of Daniel with the 70 years of Babylonian supremacy. Such a connection with Jeremiah is reasonable, since Daniel says, like we just read, that he discerned the number of years from the books, presumably one of which was the book of Jeremiah. Johnson then argues from the position that since Jeremiah 25 refers to the 70 years of servitude, and Jeremiah 29 to the 70 years of supremacy for, which we just reviewed is not necessarily correct, could be at, that Daniel would have so understood the prophecies as he was a Hebrew-speaking Jew. So Johnson connects the 70 years of Daniel 9, 1 and 2 with 70 years for Babylon, for Babylonian supremacy, versus at Babylon for servitude of the captive Jews. So Johnson is basically just assuming the view that he does argue for. Right? I'm not saying he assumes it with no evidence, but we just showed, reading Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29, Johnson could be incorrect. I think he's more correct. He's kind of explicitly correct in the statement of Jeremiah 25:11 that it's 70 years of servitude, and not desolation for the land. But the context kind of makes that possible. And then we just read in Jeremiah 29:10 that it is by no means impossible to translate the text in Jeremiah 29:10 as at Babylon. It's not necessarily for Babylon. But that's how Johnson is seeing it when he gets to Daniel 9. He's seen it in the way he understands Jeremiah 25, which I think is probably correct, and Jeremiah 29, which I'm not so sure is correct in terms of his view. So Johnson connects Daniel 9 with Jeremiah 25 and 29, and he says this: it was clear from Jeremiah's letter that the completion of Babylon's 70 years would entail the fulfilling of the desolations of Jerusalem by the return of the exiles, and it is this consequence that Daniel lays stress on in his statement. And then I write, as I see it, the problem with Johnson's argument is that it leans on one understanding of Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29, when more than one reading of the prophecies in Jeremiah exists, like we just did. The same problem exists for supporters of the Watchtower position, however. Right? Johnson could be correct, Watchtower supporters. You could be correct. But that's not enough to go running around claiming a definitive chronology that points to 1914. Just because something could be correct, you're in the realm of interpretation now, especially when there's explicit readings that state something that's not supportive of your view in Jeremiah 25:11. You have to look at the context and try to argue from that. And even Jeremiah 29:10 doesn't necessarily mean at Babylon. It could. It's not impossible. But we can't go using these kinds of potential understandings to then require absolute acceptance of a subsequent understanding in relation to these uncertain texts pointing to 1914. And that's what the Watchtower does that is not correct. It's not something you should be doing. Know that. We're going to get to it more in a moment. But I don't think Johnson and others who have attacked the Watchtower on this issue have done the best job in explaining why. They've done a good job, but they've also said things that needed correction, like I provided here. Indeed, if we rely on Jeremiah 25 or Jeremiah 29 to help us understand the meaning of Daniel's words, there is still no clear answer. All right, now let's go to our last text involving the 70 years. And we needed to do this because this is the big deal. These are the four main texts I talk about in this appendix because the 70 years, again, is what they use to count back from 537, what they call the pivotal year, to get to 607. And while there's been some variation in interpretation of 607 or 606 and the 0 year, all the way up and through 1944 in the Watchtower literature, like I talk about in my second dissertation, the fact is we need to know, is this 70 years applying to a period of servitude or desolation to the land or Babylonian supremacy? Can we count back, just straight, linearly from 537 to 607 using these 70 years? It's not clear at this point. The evidence is not explicitly in favor of the Watchtower's interpretation. The last of our four subject texts that refers to the 70 years, in which the Watchtower links to the period from 607 to 537, is 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 23. And we're going to read pretty much this whole section because it's not that long. Here's how it reads in the NWT. Furthermore, he, Nebuchadnezzar, carried off those remaining from the sword captive to Babylon. And they came to be servants to him and his sons until the royalty of Persia began to reign, to fulfill Jehovah's word by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had paid off its Sabbaths. All the days of lying desolated, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. This text refers by name to the prophecy of Jeremiah, just like Daniel 9 did, and speaks of the land paying off its Sabbaths, lying desolated to fulfill 70 years. This passage appears to support the view that the land of Judah and Jerusalem would be desolated for 70 years, consistent with how the society understands this issue. Johnson, however, argues that this contradicts Jeremiah's prophecy in chapter 25 and 29, what we read, and the text and context of 2 Chronicles 36. Okay, so again, Johnson is relying on his understanding of Jeremiah 25 and 29, which could be correct, and I think in 25 is probably correct, but contextually could involve more. And certainly in Jeremiah 29 is not impossible in terms of how NWT translates the text, like Erlandson claimed. Regarding the prophecies of Jeremiah, we have already explained how the two mentioned texts can be interpreted in harmony with the idea that the land of Judah would be desolated for 70 years. This is not an indisputable interpretation or even a necessary conclusion. And in Jeremiah 25:10 through 12, it is less probable, like I just said, than in Jeremiah 29:10 that the society is correct. But like Daniel 9, 1 and 2, 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 21 refers to Jeremiah and connects what is there prophesied with the desolate state of Jerusalem and a period of 70 years. I'm sorry, former Watchtower members and those who hate all things Watchtower and who promote only Carl Olaf Johnson's view. I'm sorry. You could be incorrect. You need to come to grips with the fact, like I asked the Watchtower Society to do, that you might not be correct. And you know what? They might be. How about that? That doesn't necessarily mean they're right about 1914. But if we don't start looking at these texts more closely and being more balanced in how we're talking about them, we're all going to keep suffering from incorrect analysis. Johnson argues that 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 21 actually invokes the prophecy of Leviticus 26, 34 through 35, since Jeremiah does not mention anything about the land paying off its Sabbaths. But this is no reason to reject the view that 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 21 refers to 70 years of desolation in relation to Jeremiah's prophecy. The chronicler directly refers to the prophecy of Jeremiah and applies language from Leviticus in relation to the desolation of the land. Jeremiah may not have referred to paying off Sabbaths, but he did describe the land as a devastated place, an object of astonishment which fits perfectly with the chronicler's use of desolation in reference to the condition of the land. 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 21 tells us that the land kept Sabbath while desolate to fulfill 70 years. That's what the text says. Here again, as is the case with Daniel 9:2, we find the term malat, to fulfill. Does this term relate to the length of time Jerusalem would be devastated? Or does it refer to the period of Babylonian supremacy within which the desolate state of Jerusalem would come to an end? 2 Chronicles 36:20 certainly provides support for Johnson's view, since it refers to the serving of Babylonian kings until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. I'm not saying Johnson is totally incorrect, but I think he's ignored some pretty significant aspects of these texts. But as has the society in the other respect. But as with Daniel, the ambiguous grammar of verse 21, which mentions 70 years in relation to the desolate state of Jerusalem, allows for alternative explanations. Both of you Watchtower supporters and you Watchtower haters, need to start to come to grips with that you both could be wrong. You need to start to accept the other side's position. Or you're for sure both wrong, because you're not balanced in your presentation of information the way you should be. It seems the best solution is the one that is in harmony with the context of the verse in question and the historical data that best supports the explanation offered. Okay, so I think we've now covered pretty sufficiently the point of my appendix regarding these 70 years and what they refer to or could refer to, and therefore whether or not counting backwards from 537 would be correct. If you want more information, if you want the rest of the discussion, and there are a ton of notes to that whole appendix we read. I didn't look at any of the notes really, except the first one referencing the Let Your Kingdom Come booklet in 1981. You should get this book when it's available online again in about a week from Elihu Books, if you don't have it already, and read it on your own. You'll see more correspondence between me and Carl Olaf Johnson. I give him space to talk more about his views, and I think in many respects he is correct. But in some respects, he and those whom he cites are not. And NWT in the Watchtower's view should be defended where it is potentially correct. It shouldn't be overstated either, Watchtower supporters. And as we're going to talk about in just a moment, we've got some more issues where it concerns counting down from 607, if that's what you want to do, to 1914, in relation to the 7 times of Daniel and the appointed times of the nations in Luke 21. I'm going to show, by reading from the text of Daniel 4:10 through Daniel 5:22, you're going to read it with me, what those 7 times involve. As we know, if you've studied Watchtower literature or you're a member of the Watchtower Society or a former member, the countdown from 607, which we just talked about in relation to 537 and the decree of Cyrus, and the texts in the Bible that talk about 70 years of servitude or desolation of the land, the Society uses those texts to establish 607 as correct, and then count down 7 times referenced in Daniel to 1914. Why did they do that? Well, let's take a look. Let's go ahead and bring up Daniel chapter 4 and see what these 7 times are about. Do they involve a period that should be counted down from 607 if we accept that as correct? Or do they involve something totally different that has nothing to do with 607? Let's see. Looks like it's all in there. Let's read Daniel chapter 4, verse 10, through Daniel chapter 5, verse 22 together. And let's see what it just says, okay? Does it give us a basis for counting down 2,520 years, which the Society interprets the 7 times as being a day for a year? 7 times they calculate as 2,520 days, even though I don't think either one of those is necessary, as we'll see. But it doesn't state a day for a year in these other texts. Not in Daniel, and not in Revelation, where it refers to 3.5 times. Right, in Daniel 4, as we're going to see in a minute, it refers to 7 times. Time, there's also a reference to 7 times in Leviticus, and uses the Hebrew word yom. And in Daniel, as you're going to see, it refers to times as well, but it uses the term Idan, the Aramaic term Idan, which is similar to yom, meaning usually a year or a period of time, right? Just like in the opening of Genesis, people sometimes refer to yom there as an actual day, even though it's used for a period of time before there were actual days the way we calculate time with a sun and a moon and the earth as it is now. Yom or Idan does not refer only or always to a day or a year. It refers to a period of time which has to be determined from the text and the context. Let's take a look. Daniel 4:10. This is Daniel now interpreting a dream for Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, well, this is Nebuchadnezzar first, relating the dream. Now the visions of my head upon my bed I happened to be beholding, and look, a tree in the midst of the earth, the height of which was immense. The tree grew up and became strong, and its very height finally reached the heavens, and it was visible to the extremity of the whole earth. Its foliage was fair, and its fruit was abundant, and there was food for all on it. Under it the beasts of the field would seek shade, and on its boughs the birds of the heavens would dwell, and from it all flesh would feed itself. Verse 13, I continued beholding in the visions of my head upon my bed, and look, a watcher, even a holy one, coming down from the heavens themselves. He was calling out loudly, and this is what he was saying to Nebuchadnezzar in his dream. Chop the tree down, and cut off its boughs, shake off its foliage, and scatter its fruitage. Let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its boughs. Verse 15, however, leave its root stock in itself in the earth, even with a banding of iron and of copper. Among the grass of the field and with the dew of the heavens, let it be wet. and with the beast let its portion be among the vegetation of the earth. Let its heart be changed from that of mankind, and let the heart of a beast be given to it, and let 7 times pass over it. By the decree of watchers the thing is, and by the saying of the holy ones the request is, to the intent that people living may know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that to the one to whom he wants to, he gives it, and he sets up over it even the lowliest one of mankind. This was the dream that I myself, King Nebuchadnezzar, beheld, and you yourself, O Belteshazzar, referring to Daniel, say what the interpretation is, for as much as all the other wise men of my kingdom are unable to make known to me the interpretation itself, but you are competent, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you, right? Because we know, Deuteronomy 32:8, Dead Sea Scrolls, the sons of God were given the nations as an inheritance. And that's why you have the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece. You had a prince of Babylon, but even that prince couldn't tell the dream to Nebuchadnezzar through their magic practicing priests. It took a captive of Israel, the nation that was overseen by Michael, whom allowed his people to be taken captive by Babylon because they needed to be punished for disobeying Jehovah, Michael's God, the one who sent that angel to lead the people through to the promised land and then oversee them as his body was being developed. It took Daniel, one of Michael's people, to interpret this dream for the king of Babylon. And so the king of Babylon is recognizing this in Belteshazzar, Daniel. Verse 19, at that time Daniel himself, whose name is Belteshazzar, was astonished for a moment, and his very thoughts began to frighten him. The king was answering, saying, O Belteshazzar, do not let the dream and the interpretation themselves frighten you. Belteshazzar was answering and saying, O my lord, may the dream apply to those hating you, and its interpretation to your adversaries. Although that's not what ended up happening. The tree that you beheld, that grew great and became strong, and the height of which finally reached the heavens, and was visible to all the earth, and the foliage of which was fair, and the fruit of which was abundant, and on which there was food for all, under which the beasts of the field would dwell, and on the boughs of which the birds of the heaven would reside. It is you, O king, because you have grown great and become strong, and your grandeur has grown great and reached the heavens, and your rulership to the extremity of the earth. And because the king beheld a watcher, even a holy one, coming down from the heavens, who was also saying, chop down the tree and ruin it, however leave its rootstock itself in the earth, but with a banding of iron and copper among the grass of the field, with the dew of the heavens let it become wet, and with the beasts of the field let its portion be, until 7 times pass over it. It is you, O king. That tree, the tree you beheld, is you, O king. 7 times are going to pass over the tree, which is the king of Babylon. This is the interpretation, O king, and the decree of the Most High is that which must befall my lord, the king of Babylon. And they will be driven away from men, and with the beasts of the field your dwelling will come to be. And the vegetation is what they will give even you to eat, just like the bulls, and with the dew of the heavens you yourself will be getting wet. And 7 times themselves will pass over you. until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdoms of mankind, and that to the one he wants, he gives it. The king of Babylon had become arrogant, even though he was allowed to take God's people captive because they had become arrogant. And that was not to be tolerated while they were the ones being used to bring forth the seed, the Messiah who would come. The king of Babylon is who's being talked about here. Not just someone, not anyone else but this king. And because they said to leave the rootstock of the tree, your kingdom will be sure to you after you know that the heavens are ruling. Watchtower supporters, it's the king of Babylon and his kingdom being chopped down. Who is the tree? You, O king. And 7 times are going to pass over you until you understand it's the Most High who is the king. And he's letting you rule. And you're acting a fool. And so a fool is who you will be. Until you understand it's the heavens ruling. It's not the prince, the son of God, who's given you this kingdom because Michael has been allowed to let these people be taken captive. No, it's nothing like that at all. It's the heavens deciding these things. Therefore, O king, may my counsel seem good to you, and remove your own sins by righteousness and your iniquity by showing mercy to the poor ones. Maybe there will occur a lengthening of your prosperity. All this befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. What does all this include, Watchtower supporters? 7 times passing over it. The tree that is the king. All this befell the king. All of it. As he acted like a beast for 7 times. It doesn't say 7 times are 2,520 years. It doesn't say anything but that 7 times are likely 7 years, which is what both Yom and Idan usually mean. Again, unless they're qualified, like in Numbers 14, as a day for a year. But it does not say this here. This is one of your fatal flaws, Watchtower supporters and Watchtower Society. You took a text or an understanding from 2 texts and you said, oh, that must also be true here. One problem. Actually, a lot of problems. But the problem here is that it doesn't say that. You took authority that you didn't have to interpret 7 times, which is typically 7 years, being applied entirely. All this, the 7 times, all of it. The tree being chopped down, all of it. The banding of iron and copper, all of it. Befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. You took something from other texts that have nothing to do with this king, and you applied a day for a year, and you expanded this 7 times that all befell this king here, and you took us all the way from 607 to 1914. You had no authority to do that here. Let's read on. At the end of 12 lunar months, he happened to be walking on the royal palace of Babylon. The king was answering, saying, is this not Babylon the Great, that I myself built for the royal house with the strength of my might and for the dignity of my majesty? While the word was yet in the king's mouth, there was a voice that fell from the heavens. To you it is being said, Watchtower supporters, Watchtower Society, to you it is being said, O Nebuchadnezzar the king, the kingdom itself has gone away from you. And from mankind they are driving even you away. With the beasts of the field your dwelling will be. Vegetation they will give even you to eat like the bulls. And 7 times themselves will what? Watchtower supporters, and Watchtower Society. Pass over this king of Babylon. Pass over you until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and to the one he wants to, he gives it. This is a message and a prophecy for the king of Babylon, who is arrogantly acting while God's people, Michael's people, are at Babylon. These 7 times befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. At that moment, the word itself was fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and from mankind he was being driven away, and vegetation he began to eat like bulls, and with the dew of the heavens his own body got to be wet, until his very hair grew long, just like the eagles, and his nails like the birds. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up to the heavens my eyes, and my own understanding began to return to me. At the end of the days, 7 times. 7 years is likely what we're talking about here, Watchtower people. There's no day for a year here. There's no beyond the king of Babylon prophecy here. This all befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. And I blessed the Most High himself, and the one living to time indefinite I praised after he acted like a beast for being so arrogant. Because his rulership is a rulership to time indefinite, and his kingdom is for generation after generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are being considered as merely nothing, and he is doing according to his own will among the army of the heavens. Right? This has nothing to do with you, Nebuchadnezzar, and how great you think you are. The moment you start thinking of how great you are, and this applies to the Watchtower people and supporters who think they're so great because of who they think they are, once you start thinking like that, while the word is yet in your mouth, you're going to find out it is not like that. And that word's going to fall right out of your mouth, and it's going to be replaced with praise for the one who makes all things take place. And you will know that you are nothing, just like the king of Babylon was brought to in disgrace. It is Jehovah and those he appoints to do his will among the army of the heavens and the inhabitants of the earth, and there exists no one that can check his hand and that can say to him, "What have you been doing?" Don't you ever completely trust in humans, because you can check them. You should check them. Revelation 2:2. What are you doing? You can't do that to the Most High. At that same time, my understanding began to return to me, and for the dignity of my kingdom and my majesty and my brightness themselves began to return to me. And for even the Most High royal officers and my grandees began eagerly searching. And I was reestablished upon my own kingdom, and greatness extraordinary was added to me. 7 times ended here, Watchtower supporters in society. They all ended right here to show the king of Babylon who was really in charge here. This has nothing to do with 1914. It has nothing to do with a countdown from 607 to 1914. Even if we give you all the 70 years texts that we just reviewed, you have no basis for doing anything like you do next and counting down these 7 times as if they're a day for a year, which isn't mentioned one single time like it is in Numbers 14 and Ezra 4, yet you do it here. Why? You have no authority to do that here. It doesn't apply. It applies right here to the king of Babylon. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of heavens, because all his works are truth and his ways are justice. And because those who are walking in pride, he is able to humiliate. Stop walking in pride, Watchtower Society. Stop using these texts to glorify yourselves. You're going to be humbled until you do what Nebuchadnezzar had to do, and that is start praising the one who deserves it, not you. Not you. As regards, now we're getting to Nebuchadnezzar's son. Let's follow this a little bit forward. Verse 1, and as regards Belshazzar the king, he made a big feast for 1,000 of his grandees, and in front of the 1,000 he was drinking wine. Belshazzar, this is Nebuchadnezzar's son, under the influence of the wine, said to bring in the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken away from the temple that was in Jerusalem. Jehovah may let you take his people captive, but he's going to watch what you do. They're always watching. They're the watchers. Just like we saw that other watching and do. We're watching Nebuchadnezzar and his son right here. Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar started under the influence of wine to blaspheme Jehovah by taking the temple vessels, that from them the king and his grandness, his concubines, and his secondary wives might drink. At that time they brought in the vessels of gold that they had taken away from the temple of the house of God that was in Jerusalem, and from them the king, Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, but it relates, and his grandees and his concubines and his secondary wives drank. They drank wine. They praised the gods of gold and of silver, copper, iron, wood, and stone. Even though we just read how Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar's father, after becoming arrogant, had learned that very lesson not to do these things. Don't praise the wrong gods. Praise the King of heaven, even if you're a Babylonian king. As soon as they started doing that, Belshazzar and his wives and all those with him, at that moment, right, just like Nebuchadnezzar started to praise himself and Babylon the Great, right as that happened, the fingers of a man's hand came forth and were writing in front of the lampstand upon the plaster of the wall of the palace of the king. And the king was beholding the back of the hand that was writing. At that time, as regards the king, his very complexion was changed in him. He saw the writing on the wall. And his own thoughts began to frighten him. And his hip joints were loosening, and his very knees were knocking each other. The king was calling out loudly to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king was answering and saying to the wise men in Babylon, any man that will read this writing and show me its interpretation, with purple he will be clothed, with a necklace of gold about his neck, and as the third one in the kingdom he will rule. At that time all the wise men of the king were coming in, but they were not competent enough to read the writing itself, or to make known to the king the interpretation. Consequently, King Belshazzar was very much afraid, and his complexion was changing within him, and his grandees were perplexed. Right? He praised the gods, the prince of his kingdom, and look what happened next. It takes one of God's people, one of Michael's people, to come in and tell them what's happening, what's going to happen next. Consequently, King Belshazzar was very much afraid. His complexion changed. We read that. As regards the queen, because of the words of the king and his grandees, she entered right in to the banqueting hall. The queen answered and said, O king, keep living even to times indefinite. Do not let your thoughts frighten you, nor let your complexion be changed. Verse 11, there exists a capable man in your kingdom in whom there is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father that we just read, illumination and insight and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, set him up as chief of the magic practicing priests and conjurers and Chaldeans and astrologers, even your father, O king. For as much as an extraordinary spirit and knowledge and insight to interpret dreams and the explanation of riddles and the untying of knots had been found in him, in Daniel, whom the king himself named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel himself be called, that he may show the very interpretation, just like he did before, about the 7 times relating to the king Nebuchadnezzar. And all of that being fulfilled in him. Nothing else was mentioned. Accordingly, Daniel himself was brought in before the king. We're going to read to verse 22. We're almost done. The king was speaking up and saying to Daniel, "Are you the Daniel that is of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Judah? I've also heard concerning you that the Spirit of gods is in you, and illumination and insight and wisdom extraordinary have been found in you. And now there have been brought in before me the wise men and the conjurers, that they may read this very writing, even to make known to me its interpretation. But they are not competent enough to show the very interpretation of the word. And I myself have heard concerning you that you're able to furnish interpretations, to untie knots themselves. Now, if you are able to read the writing and to make known to me its very interpretation, with purple you will be clothed, with a necklace of gold around your neck, and the third one in the kingdom you will rule, as the third one in the kingdom." At that time Daniel was answering and saying before the king, "Let your gifts prove to be with you yourself, and your presents do you give to others. However, I shall read the writing itself to the king, and the interpretation I shall make known." Let's pay attention closely here. "As for you, king, the Most High God himself gave to Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom and the greatness and the dignity and the majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all the peoples, national groups, and languages proved to be a quaking and showing fear before him. Whom he happened to want to, he was killing. And whom he happened to want to, he was striking. And whom he happened to want to, he was exalting. And whom he happened to want to, he was humiliating. But when his heart became haughty and his spirit became hard, so as to act presumptuously, he was brought down from the throne of his kingdom." This has nothing to do, and it had nothing to do, and as Daniel's telling Nebuchadnezzar's son, it has to do with the kingdom of Babylon, not Zedekiah being removed from the kingdom of Judah. And his own dignity was taken away from him. And from the sons of mankind he was driven away. His very heart was made like that of a beast. With the wild asses his dwelling was. Vegetation they would give him to eat, just like the bulls. And with the dew of the heavens his own body got to be wet, until he knew the Most High God is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that to the one whom he wants to, he sets up over it. And as for you, his son Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. Did any of you get anything from what we just read involving the tree in Nebuchadnezzar's head that Daniel interpreted and made explicit to what happened to him? 7 times passed over him, and his kingdom was given back to him. And then when it started to happen to his son, Jehovah did the same thing to him and brought Daniel into him and told him, you knew all that happened to your father, and you did the same thing. So, here's what I'm going to do to you. But my point in reading to this point is to explain to all of you what is very clear in these texts. Is it not? There is no connection whatsoever between the 7 times of Daniel and the tree in the dream in his head, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and 607 BCE. There is no connection between the 7 times that all happened to him the tree is the king, and all of this, including the 7 times that we're passing over, happened to Nebuchadnezzar. They're not explained in any way as applying to anything or anyone else, nor are they interpreted or associated to anything else but Edan, which is a year usually. 7 years. Not 2,520 days that you then interpret as 2,520 years because of explicit applications of a day for a year in 2 totally different books and contexts. That's what the Watchtower Society has done. And that's why, everyone, it doesn't matter whether or not 607 is correct. It doesn't matter whether or not 70 years involves servitude or desolation of the land in the text that we reviewed. Without the 7 times of Daniel being interpreted as 2,520 years, counting down from 607 BCE, there's no 1914 anywhere. I'm sorry. There never was any connection between these 7 times and anything involving anyone or any kingdom but Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. They're wrong. Or if they're right, it has nothing to do with this account, right? There's some new light or something telling them something we can't see, that nobody can see, and doesn't even seem to be correct at all. So they have misinterpreted this account completely by not applying it the way the account applies it. And the interpretation given of the dream by Daniel. It's not like something we have to go figuring out. If the dream was all we had, maybe you could try to, even then, right? But Daniel explains it, Watchtower supporters and society. He tells you what it means right here. We just read it all. And then he goes on to explain to Nebuchadnezzar's son that that's what it meant. There is absolutely no basis for connecting these 7 times of Daniel, this tree, this chopping down, this kingdom, with the establishment of God's kingdom in 1914 or any other time other than in this king at this time who had become so arrogant that it was time that he understood who's ruling, no matter who seems to be ruling. So stop fooling with what we can all read as the meaning of these texts. They're pretty clear, I would say, in context. Now, let's go to our second main text. So we just read a significant context of Daniel 4:32, where it talks about these things and how Daniel 4:23 and the 7 times passing over this king so that he understood who's really ruling, and then he was given back his kingdom when those days were completed, right? When he had come to the end of those days passing over him, 2,520 days, 7 years, 7 times, is giving back the kingdom. It's not talking about the reestablishment of a kingdom or the tree growing again 2,520 years later. There's nothing here that shows that. Let's go to Luke 21. Luke 21 and the appointed times of the nations. What are they talking about? Well, there's nothing in Daniel that we just read that suggests it's talking about anything but Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. So what is Jesus talking about? I believe this is just as clear as it was clear in what we read from Daniel. And they're not talking about the same thing. Not even close. Just because it uses the word times, right? That's used in other texts as well, like Leviticus, like Revelation. Okay, but not these. They don't use a day for a year in those texts. Neither did they in Daniel, and neither do they in Luke 21. Luke 21. Let's read verses 20 through 27, which includes our second subject text, verse 24. Luke 21, through 27. This is the text, or includes the text, referring to the appointed times of the Gentile times, that the Watchtower Society has connected with the 7 times that aren't connected with what we read in Daniel about those 7 times. Here's what they're connected with. This is Jesus talking, and he explains what he's talking about. Furthermore, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, then you know that the desolating of her has drawn near. Does this appear like it's at all talking about prior desolations of Jerusalem? No. He's talking about something that's going to happen, right? He's telling his disciples, when you see this, then you know this is getting close. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, then you know that the desolating of her has drawn near. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Let those in the midst of her withdraw, and let those in the country places not enter into her. Because these are the days for meting out justice, that all the things written may be fulfilled. Woe to the pregnant woman and the ones suckling a baby in those days. For there will be great necessity upon the land and wrath on this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations, the Gentile times, are fulfilled. Also, there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth anguishes of nations, not knowing the way out because of the roaring of the sea and its agitation, while men become faint out of fear and expectation of the things coming upon the inhabited earth, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. What's this talking about, Watchtower supporters, or just anybody? Well, we know what it's talking about, don't we? That's why I put on the thumbnail to this video an image of what it's talking about. I'll bring it up to you for you here in just a moment. Let me make it a little bigger. This is what that is talking about, isn't it? It's talking about when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Romans, first by Vespasian in 66 AD. But then, because Nero went totally insane and the Romans kept having to deal with different changes in authority, different emperors, Vespasian was recalled. He went back, secured the emperorship, and that is what Jesus is talking about here, is it not? When he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, know that the desolating of her has drawn near. It's not talking about Babylon. It's talking about the Romans. And he's telling them, when you see this happen, right? This is like 36 years before it happens. When you see Jerusalem surrounded, you better get out. You better get out. Because these are the days for meting out justice on those who rejected the Son of God and put him to death. And when Vespasian left, that was the opportunity to get out of Jerusalem. And the Son of God was warning them right here. Because in 70 AD, Vespasian sent his son Titus. And the destruction of Jerusalem and all the horrors that happened at that time are written in detail by Josephus. And here you see a digitally enhanced image. I'll try to make it a little bigger. Of the Arch of Titus. And it shows the Romans carrying away all the spoils of the destruction that happened. All the things from the temple, the trumpets, the menorah, the showbread. Coins were minted that show and speak of the defeat of Judea. The Colosseum, it's called the Colosseum because of the statue of Nero, but it's really part of the Flavian dynasty, right? Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. This is what Jesus is talking about. This is what he's referring to as the appointed times of the nations. They didn't even start until this happened. This period of time when Jerusalem was being trampled by the nations, the Gentile times, Watchtower, didn't even begin until 70 AD CE. How long are they to last? He doesn't say. He doesn't give any number of times. He just says they're going to be punished and sent captive into all the nations, right? They're not going to be able to have Jerusalem the way they had it up until 70 AD as a temple of worship to his Father until whatever time has been appointed is fulfilled. It has nothing to do with Daniel and the 7 times that were fulfilled on Nebuchadnezzar the king because of his arrogance. It had nothing to do with Zedekiah. It had everything to do with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon at that time. Those 7 times. These times aren't said to be 7 times, and they're times of the nations. They're not even specific to Babylon, because they didn't even happen until they started with the Roman captivity that then continued on until you might say, right, if you're trying to come up with an end to this, you might suggest it was in, the 1940s when Jerusalem became a state again? I'm not saying that's what it is, but certainly the state of Jerusalem is now no longer one where they are captive to all the nations. But that's not 1914, is it? That's not a countdown from 7 times that aren't said to be a day for a year times from 607 to 1914. The prophecy in Daniel is specific to Babylon and the Babylonian king at that time. It was fulfilled. It's done. The prophecy at this time begins in 70 AD when what Jesus prophesied took place and continues until those taken captive from that time are no longer captive in all the nations. There is no basis whatsoever for applying the 7 times of Daniel to anything but Nebuchadnezzar. And there is no connection made anywhere between those 7 times and the appointed times of the nations. There's no day for a year here. There's no association with Nebuchadnezzar here. They're specific to a period of time coming up during the time of Jesus. So there's just no basis at all. Even if we grant all the 70-year texts as 70 years of captivity or desolation of the land and count back from 537 to 607, it has nothing to do with 1914 or 2,520 years counting from 607 to 1914 or anything but Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel or the Jews being led into captive into all the nations after they were surrounded by the Romans and then the Christians and others given a chance to flee before Titus came to finish what his father was prepared to do. From then on have been the appointed times of the nations, Watchtower people. And even when we get to Revelation, right, the 1,260 days, the 3.5 times, none of those are associated with a day for a year either. And the Watchtower doesn't either, right? Because they applied those 3.5 days, those 3.5 times from 1914 forward, October 1914 to 1918, when they claimed that God and Christ sat as refiners before they selected the early members of the Watchtower Society as the faithful slave in 1919. That's what they believe. I talk about that more in my chronology second dissertation about 1919, 1918, 1914. It has nothing to do with Daniel's 7 times. It has nothing to do with the Gentile times of Luke 21:24. There's no basis in the Bible for us to be teaching 1914 anymore. There never was. There was just a great war. And there were a lot of interpretations associated with 1914 and a lot of other dates, like I talk about in that second dissertation. Even in Matthew 24, it doesn't speak of a great war. It speaks of nation rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom as part of the sign of the end times, which have been happening since the kingdom of God was established, not in 1914, but when the Son of God went to his Father's right hand. Let's share a couple final texts together so that you understand that application, and hopefully do your best to stop teaching this association between the Gentile times and the 7 times of Daniel and applying day for year principles that have nothing to do with the Gentile times or Daniel to get to 1914 just because there was a war that wasn't even as great as the war that came after World War II. And it doesn't even say there would be one great war anyway. It's just there would be these ongoing wars. Hear of wars and reports of wars. Don't be terrified. It's going to keep happening, just like today, until the end comes. That's not a sign. That was never a sign that you're supposed to point to and say, birth of God's kingdom, 7 times of Daniel, day for a year principle that doesn't even have anything to do with it. We'll apply here. Gentile times there. We're appointed 3.5 years later after the inspection, 1919, we're released from prison. Boom. We're the appointed mouthpiece of God. And then you go forward and teach all kinds of things that have nothing to do with God. You tell people millions of people living will never die. by 1925 that the princes are going to return, which they didn't just say. They thought that would happen in 1914 too. A lot of things they were teaching that are not true. But my focus here is the appointed times of the nations in Luke 21:24, and whether they're associated with the 7 times of Daniel 4. They're not. They never were. And any just basic reading of these texts would have shown you that. But they took a text from here, they took a text from there, and they kept writing about things we're told, as we're going to see in a moment, we don't need to have written to us. Let's take a look at the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 32. Remember, I said that the kingdom of God was born when the Christ was raised to his Father's right hand, as he began to put his enemies as a footstool for his feet. And you're going to see why I believe the application is complete, starting with Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, verse 32. This Jesus God resurrected, of which fact we are all witnesses. Therefore, because he was exalted to the right hand of God and received the promised Holy Spirit from the Father, he has poured out this which you see and hear. Right? And then he goes on to quote the Psalm of David, Psalm 110:1. Jehovah said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I place your enemies as a stool for your feet. Because that's the point from which God made him Lord and Christ. He was Lord before as Michael, right, the great prince, but in being raised to the right hand of God, this lordship is complete. This is Philippians 2, 9 through 11 complete. He has been exalted as Lord in that further sense in which we all bow before him as Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Let's look at Revelation 12. What does it say? It's another text, right, that's applied to 1914. I don't think so, Watchtower people. I think it was applied and applies to the time when Jesus was raised to the Father's right hand and poured out the Holy Spirit, like we just read in Acts 2. Well, I can't give a specific date, right? But at the time when that happened, around Pentecost, he was made Lord in that sense in which we all bowed to him to the glory of God the Father as King. And notice how Revelation 12 speaks of something very similar, if not the same thing. Revelation 12:1, and a great sign was seen in heaven, a woman arrayed with the sun, and the moon was beneath her feet, and on her head was a crown of 12 stars. What did Luke 21 say you would see, Watchtower people? Sign and sun and moon and stars. Right from the time when the appointed times of the nations began in 70 A.D. Here, look at what you have. Sign and sun and moon and stars, the same thing. She was pregnant and cries out in her pains and her agony to give birth, and another sign was seen in heaven. And look, a fiery colored dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, upon its head 7 diadems. This is the Satan in heaven, before he fell from heaven as lightning. Like Jesus said he saw, but hadn't yet occurred because he saw it was about to occur. Who drags 1/3 of the stars of heaven and hurled them down to the earth, and the dragon kept standing before the woman who was about to give birth. The kingdom, I believe, in this sense, that the dragon was ready to try to interfere with by having Jesus fail rather than die faithful as he entered into Judas's heart to betray him, to begin a period of the greatest testing of the Messiah, to the point where he even said, Father, if it's your will, save me from this. That's how close Satan got, but he missed. That when she did give birth, it might devour her child, and she gave birth to a son, a male, who is to shepherd all the nations with an iron rod. And her child was caught away to God and to his throne. What did it say in Acts 2:32 through 33? He was raised to God's right hand. on his throne, like Revelation 2 and 3 tell us further. It says right here that child was caught away to God and to his throne. So just like in Acts 2, Satan failed to stop the Messiah from being resurrected to God and to his throne. And then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there for 1,260 days, not years. It's not a day for a year here. And war broke out in heaven. What does it say in Acts 2:34 through 36? Your enemies will be placed as a stool for your feet. All knees will bow to the Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Right after this child is born and caught away to God and to his throne, where sign in sun and moon and stars are being seen, Michael fights with the dragon in heaven. And he beats him. And he throws him out down to the earth, being placed as a footstool for the Son of God. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now have come to pass the salvation and power and kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. Why? Because the accuser of our brothers has been thrown out, who accuses them day and night. Why? Messiah had not yet died, had not yet been resurrected, had not yet paid the price, so that Satan could keep entering in before God, like in Job, and accusing us day and night. Now, no, he's out and down as a footstool for the Christ. It's not just God placing him as a footstool. It's Michael. It's the authority of his Christ. The Christ that is at his right hand, pouring out the Holy Spirit. Because the kingdom of God is born. The child was caught away to God and to his throne. It all makes sense. And even if you don't accept this part, right, the kingdom of God being born in this way that I've been talking about in relation to Acts 2 and Revelation 12, well, let's take a look at Matthew 13, our second to last text. There's still no basis for identifying 1914, I'll tell you that, but it makes a lot more sense to see the kingdom of God being born around 33 to 36 CE, however you interpret the resurrection of the Christ, or him paying the price and then pouring out the Holy Spirit from the throne of God, and the events described in Revelation 12 that match all that. It seems to me the devil's been down since that time. And he's been acting in the ways that Revelation goes on to describe, as a dragon who goes down to the sand of the sea, right down on the earth with you and me. A dragon with horns like a lamb, like the Christ, lying to people, just like he's done the whole time. Matthew 13, what did Jesus say the conditions would be from his time? What did he say about the kingdom of the heavens from his time? He said it would be like a field. Specifically in Matthew 13:24, like a man that sowed fine seed in his field. The kingdom of the heavens has become like a man that sowed fine seed in his field. This is Jesus, right? He's the Son, the man, sowing this seed while he's here right now, giving this illustration, and since being resurrected to the throne of God and pouring out Holy Spirit. The kingdom of the heavens has become like a man that sowed fine seed in his field. While the men were sleeping, his enemy came in. What did Revelation 12 say happened to the devil? He was thrown down to the field, to the earth, where I believe he came in and started to oversow weeds in among the wheat. Where are the wheat? In the earth, in the field. Just like the devil has been confined to since the kingdom's birth, after the Son of God was given authority at God's right hand to throw him down to the sand of the sea with you and me. When the blade sprouted and produced fruit, then the weeds appeared also. So the slaves of the householder came up and said to him, Master, did you not sow fine seed in the field? How then does it come to have weeds? He said to them, An enemy, a man did this. Sounds like someone on the earth. They said to him, Do you want us then to go out and collect them? He said, No, that by chance you uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and in the harvest season I will tell the reapers, first collect the weeds and bind them in bundles and burn them up. Then go on gathering the wheat into my storehouse. He goes on then, after dismissing the crowd, to explain to his disciples, the sower of the fine seed is the Son of Man. So the kingdom of the heavens began with the Son of Man being Jesus on earth. The field is the world, the earth. The fine seed are the sons of the kingdom that was given birth. But the weeds are the sons of the wicked one, the enemy that sowed them. That man is the devil. And the harvest is the conclusion of a system of things, and the reapers are angels. Therefore, just as the weeds are collected and burned with fire, so it will be in the conclusion. Son of Man will send forth his angels, collect out from his kingdom all things that cause stumbling in persons who are doing lawlessness. The kingdom was not born in 1914. It has nothing to do with 1914. It has nothing to do with the 7 times of Daniel. It has to do something with the appointed times of the nations, only because that's a prophecy that relates to Jerusalem and Israel, but really not to the time when the Son of Man paid the price and the devil was there trying to keep him from paying that price by devouring the child before he could do so and be taken to the throne of God, after which he's thrown out of heaven. Just like Jesus said he saw him as he was throwing out the demons from those who were infected by them with his power. He knew that would eventually lead to Satan being removed, have no power in heaven, and thrown down to the earth to sow these weeds among the wheat in his kingdom. That's when the kingdom was born, Watchtower Society supporters, in the 1st century, when the Messiah gave his life and was resurrected to the throne of God and poured out Holy Spirit. And the wheat was sown in the world, and then the devil was thrown out, and the authority of the Christ and the kingdom of our God began. And then that wicked one came down as a man, or however that is. He's on the earth, is what I'm saying. He's an enemy made for the footstool of the Christ, and began sowing wheat. He's so angry, right? He went off to wage war with the woman because he's so angry. And he did all this damage to the field of wheat. And the Messiah and his wisdom, with his enemies at his feet, and the angels saying, let's go get those weeds and protect that wheat. He's so wise with Jehovah's eyes, he knows We needed to grow together with those weeds so we could be tested. So he could find out who would be faithful and discreet. And I can tell you right now, when it comes to what you should teach, it does not have anything to do with times and seasons other than a couple reasons. Let's go to them right now and close this up. 1 Thessalonians 5. You want to know what you're supposed to be writing about and not writing about when it comes to times and seasons, Watchtower? Well, here it is. As for times and seasons, brothers, you need nothing to be written to you. Nothing to be written to you about times and seasons. Watchtower, you can't stop writing about times and seasons. I have a whole second dissertation in here with so many dates and seasons that you have been writing about for no good reasons. Stop it. Stop writing about what you're not to be writing about and that you've gotten wrong almost every time. For so long, it's damaged a lot of people. For you yourselves know quite well that Jehovah's day, the Lord's day, is coming as a thief. Do you know when a thief's coming? No. Then please do not speak of what you think you know about that thief. Whenever it is they are saying peace and security, sudden destruction will be instantly upon them as the pangs of distress upon a pregnant woman, and they will by no means escape. But you, brothers, you're not in darkness, so that that day should overtake you as it would thieves. We're not in darkness, Watchtower. We're sons of the light. So why don't you stop writing about darkness, things you don't understand, and that we're told we don't need anything to be written. Just keep telling us it's coming as a thief, and you don't need to keep reminding us. We're sons of light. We get it. We can see. We can also see peace and security. We get it. Okay, so if you want to say something, just leave it right there. Do you get it? One last text, in case you forget it. 2 Thessalonians 2:2. Let's start with 1. However, brothers, respecting the presence, parousia, Watchtower, of our Lord Jesus Christ, and our being gathered together to him, we request you not to be quickly shaken from your reason, nor be excited. Watchtower, have you gotten excited? Why? You were told right here not to get excited. About what? Either through an inspired expression, like the dream in Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar the king, or the appointed times of the nations by the king, or through a verbal message, or through a letter as though from us. To the effect that the day of Jehovah or the Lord is near. Is it not crystal clear? Everybody, what we're supposed to do and not supposed to do? Was it not clear what Daniel and the Daniel 4 and the 7 times and the tree were referring to, and the appointed times of the nations in Luke 21:24? And that we're not supposed to be getting excited or exciting other people through a letter or an expression about the day of the Lord being here. Watchtower people, you're directly told and warned by Jesus in Luke 21:8 not to claim to be the Christ and claim the end is near. You're directly told right here, after he already wrote that you don't need anything to be written about times and seasons except thief in the night and peace and security. You're all over the place with these days for years and times and seasons and Gentile times for no good reasons. And yet it says right here, we're making a request, everybody, regarding the parousia, everybody, and our being gathered together to him, the resurrection. Not to be shaken, not to be excited, not through an expired expression like in Daniel or Luke 21 or anywhere else, or a verbal message, right? Someone telling you something, or a letter as though from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is here. That's all we hear, for the most part, Watchtower Society and supporters. You've been doing this to such an extent, it's embarrassing. It's humiliating. You've humiliated yourself just like Nebuchadnezzar was humiliated, because you are going to learn, no matter how much you have to learn, that it is not you who is ruling. It is not you who is governing. And you're not supposed to be doing any of this stuff to any of us or to yourselves. It is the Most High who is ruling, and his Son. And they are watching. And soon, I don't know how soon, could be many years, soon may be relative for us in terms of our years, they are going to separate us. Right now, we're all growing together, you and us. But if you don't stop violating these texts and applying prophecies to things they have nothing to do with, you might find yourself on the wrong side of the separation between the wheat and the weeds in God's kingdom.